Today in AI Pro Docs, the AI Engineer podcast, we have a fantastic episode with Duncan and Timo from SuperDuperDB, which is not a database, but we'll get into the details a bit later. And of course, our deep dive session with Max. But before we get into all that, let us discuss a little bit about what is happening in the vector embeddings space and the models around them. I had in fact already recorded this segment, but as it happens in the generative AI space, things move too quick and I had to update it because things change completely in matters of hours. So what happened? First, earlier this week, OpenAI launched a new set of vector embeddings models that are not only more performant than the ones that we currently have, but also with a very attractive pricing. And for a few days, one of these models was the cheapest one, and it offered a very good trade-off between performance and price. But just today, Together AI, which is this startup that lets you deploy open source models and AI infrastructure on the cloud, announced as well that it was slashing its pricing structure and it became the cheapest from all vendors. It is likely that in the next days and weeks, this pricing battle and the benchmarks and which one is the cheapest and which one is the best one and so on will be changing. So let us not get into that. Let's try to see the big picture and decide when we should use which type of model. Do we need at all this type of models? And what are the things that we as AI engineers should be paying attention to? It is first a question of, should we always use the OpenAI vector embeddings models? Well, as with everything from OpenAI, it is more a question of comfort rather than really pricing, where yes, they tend to have reasonable pricing, but at the same time, what makes it much more interesting it is that it is the standard. Everyone doing something with AI, one way or the other, uses OpenAI technology. Also, for large organizations, is the benefit of having everything from one single invoice, which is very convenient versus having to deal with multiple vendors and multiple billing systems and so on and so forth. However, if the decision is more about trying to optimize every single piece of the stack, then yes, OpenAI is not the best option and it is important to shop around. Here, something such as Together AI is a very attractive alternative for using vector embedding models. And then it's of course the question of why not to host these locally? Just let us rent some cloud instances or even in our own machines and so on. Why use these cloud models with their respective APIs? Well, of course, always the question of do we have the technical resources for this? Because maintaining this type of models is non-trivial. Deploying them, optimizing them, and so on and so forth is always a challenge. But on the other side, if you really want to understand things, if you really want to dig deep, as an AI engineer, it makes sense to do this on your own from beginning to the end. If on the other side, you are at an organization who needs to be paying attention to resources, maybe there is not enough people in the team to handle everything, then of course, it does not make sense to host everything yourself. You should be trying to optimize things. And this goes a little bit hand in hand with the spirit of our discussion about SuperDuperDB, which is this glue connecting different models, techniques, databases, infrastructure around generative AI and around classical machine learning. But going back to the question of vector embeddings, do we need them? Of course we need them. They're essential. They are the data format of the generative AI wave. So far, most people we're not really paying too much attention to them and only relying to what OpenAI was offering, and also not really thinking what goes into them. It was a little bit of like a black box. But not only releases in the open source space, but also this whole debate and pricing war that is happening will be drawing more and more attention to the whole vector embedding space. And I see this forming similar to the topic of vector databases, where we'll have a multitude of models, like a zoo of models for vector embeddings. And this will be what will differentiate between a senior AI engineer and a junior one, where the senior AI engineer will know when to use which models for which situation and when do they perform best. If it is, for example, for video data, for time series, for images, text, and so on and so forth. Whereas likely a more junior AI engineer will resort to just calling the OpenAI endpoint and using that. So in a nutshell, if you need everything from just one provider, go ahead and take what OpenAI is offering. Of course, it's a very reasonable option. If on the other side, you want to optimize every single piece of the stack, go and shop around. Together AI is a great option, but there are others. And if you think you need to really understand everything in detail, or also you might be very budget constrained, then deploy this on your own. But be aware that this comes with complexity, this comes with many challenges that you can save yourself by recurring to one of these cloud vendors. And of course, if you really want to understand everything that's happening in the generative AI space, then you really have to understand what is happening around vector embeddings. Similar to this, recently I wrote an article about how to generate vector embeddings using only your browser with JavaScript. And this shows how there are not only these very heavy models that are in the cloud offered by OpenAI and other vendors, but also with your own laptop from your own browser, you can be creating these embeddings, of course, much more simple. So for smaller sentences, for smaller corpora, but nevertheless, you can get results that are very impressive. So check that out. And as usual, remember to give us your feedback, like, subscribe, comment this video, because we are the AI engineer, the AI community for hackers. This is our second episode of AI products. And as usual, I'm joined by Max, a veteran in the VC and innovation space. Hi, Max. How are you today?
I'm doing good, thank you. Looking forward to the weekend, I suppose. How about you? How you doing?
Exactly. So the weekend stands in front of us. And
Mm,
although the week is almost over, today we have a very exciting discussion about
yeah.
something that sounds like it's a database, but is not a database. Its name is
Yeah.
SuperDuperDB. Have you heard about them, Max?
Yeah, Super Duper DV. I must say I love the name. And it's also quite interesting to hear, they're not really a DB. They're trying to make your DB become super duper, as we have heard from the founders. So I found that really interesting. So yeah, I think they're doing something really cool. Making applications a lot quicker for people to deploy, especially for folks who don't really necessarily have all the AI knowledge, but also to be able to leverage it to build applications, AI applications on top of traditional database. So I thought that was pretty cool. How about yourself, Rod? What do you think of it?
Exactly. So, for anyone who has never heard of SuperDuperDB, is a very young startup. They went live, started to promote themselves late last year. The idea behind is that they add a layer on top of your database to enable you to do things related to machine learning and AI applications. So the idea is it is hard to do any type of AI application. Doesn't matter if it is classical machine learning or generative AI. And you need many roles and many libraries in order to glue all this code together to get something that can be used. This takes time, is difficult, and complicated. So SuperDuperDB offers this glue and simplicity to, let's say, enable a single developer to do what a full team will require. And you have seen a little bit the business model, a little bit the team, and so on, Max. What is your impression? So you have this framework on how to validate startups. So how's it look for you?
So interesting. I think you're just to add on your description where you're talking about all the different glues of gluing an AI application together. In my head, I think of super glue because it's just one thing that pulls everything together and allows you to
True.
deploy applications really quicker. It's pretty cool. I think based on the team, I think the team has a very good, I would say, experience in this space. Because obviously Timo on his first application, he was building some sort of search application for the e-commerce space. He was doing very well, and eventually he comes out and he tried to build like a, AI based innovation lab slash studio, if you will, which, at the back of it, he built a couple of things and decided to go full time on SuperDuperDB. And similarly, Duncan, the CTO, was also very interesting, right? Based on the interview, the founder didn't start to code until 23. So guys, it's never too late. And and then from there, he just so in love with AI and machine learning applications, just started building. I feel like both of them had some sort of like domain knowledge in this space, both from an application perspective as well as from a developer perspective. I personally felt that, one insight they probably got from their past life is that building an AI application is a pain. Can you take that pain away in order to get to, certain level of AI applications that is, functional? Number one. Number two, I also, kind of agree with his thoughts, which is, 99% of your AI application doesn't need to scale like crazy, right? Because there will be applications that are doesn't need to be so performant, but needs to be good enough to improve your solution. So I guess that's the reason why I brought this up, is because I felt that the team has some sort of like inside knowledge on this space specifically. Um, I feel like, given that, they have done building and everything, it feels like they're doer themselves. That's it. They built something and release it in a relatively short time, and they continue to build up the solution. But yeah, happy to hear your thoughts as well, Rod. From a builder perspective, from an AI founder perspective, what do you think?
What I like is that I see how it is indeed complicated to do AI applications. You always require many frameworks, technologies, knowledge, and so on.
Mhm.
And this is not available to everyone. So the idea of enabling traditional software developers who are familiar with databases, building applications to do any type of machine learning AI, this is always fascinating. And I keep thinking about parallels in history. So, for example, always I think about something such as Ruby on Rails. That Ruby on Rails is this framework that became this standard to build any type of web applications. Before Ruby on Rails, the ideas existed, but there was not a single framework or application that had so joined all this set of engineering and architecture ideas into a single cohesive package. And then
Mhm.
it became so popular, it became the standard. And I can imagine that with SuperDuperDB, this is the final goal. The objective is that this becomes this lingua franca for development of AI applications, and that um, introduces like the best practices, the rules, and how things should be done. And this is the goal, but it's also necessary because, of course, as it is always with these type of frameworks, you need to learn the rules, the grammar, how they work. Every framework has always their learning curve, their quirks, and so on and so forth. So for a developer, it only makes sense to start getting into a framework such as SuperDuperDB if it already has some traction, if, for example, the job market demands it, or if there is a specific reason that makes it worth the time to spend on it. And we can still already see it. So they have now more than 3,000 stars on GitHub. They are becoming more popular. And you even told me you had heard of them. So it seems that, yeah, they're making some noise.
Yeah, it's super interesting from that perspective. Like you mentioned Ruby and Rails, I was thinking on top of my head, in order to become the lingua franca of of a AI application deployment and development, you probably need a lot of people to use it. And I don't know if you know the history of Ruby on Rails. My understanding is one of the co-founder of Airbnb was also a huge contributor to Ruby on Rails. And of course, needless to say, I believe Airbnb also use Ruby on Rails a lot. So it's like the entire Airbnb is built on Ruby on Rails. I remember a friend of mine told me this. And I find that super interesting. So then the question becomes, let's say some big company decided to deploy SuperDuperDB as the framework to deploy AI application, and they take off. And I think that will help with the adoption of SuperDuperDB as the lingua franca. It's just something that crossed my mind when you say Ruby and Rails. And I think personally, it's a very very interesting space because it feels a lot like a power law outcome. If it works, everyone use it. Voila, you're in business, right? If it's not, then you will still power a small community of folks that continue to use it. But what excites me is the ability to let a layman like me to be able to use the Python interface to deploy some AI related application. And for me, that's super important. That's super interesting. And if you join some sort of hackathon, I feel like it's a no-brainer to be able to to play with something like this if you're given some sort of database that to book this on top of it. So personally, I think I am quite excited about the ability to use the technology to to quote Facebook, to move fast and break things, if you will. So I think that's what excites me a lot. But I guess my question to you, Rod, obviously being a technical founder yourself, knowing the market very well, have you seen, I guess, alternatives to some of SuperDuperDB's what SuperDuperDB is trying to offer? For example, some sort of like bundling. Because the way I think about it is they kind of rebundle everything into one neat package and best practice where you can just deploy AI applications quicker instead of having your entire ML ops supply chain of data, clean data, deploying applications, hosting of applications, etc. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think about this from a builder perspective? Are they alternatives, approaches that people are taking in this space?
Yes, what I see as the closest alternative to SuperDuperDB is a company called MindsDB. They have been around a bit longer. They were part of Y Combinator, and they are quite popular. So in terms of users as well as investor interest. So if you look at their GitHub repository, they have 19,000 stars and more. And they have also attracted investor interest. So they have raised more than 50 million US dollars. And the product looks similar, but there are some differences that are notable. So, and this can be maybe a strength or potential weakness of for SuperDuperDB, where with MindsDB, you need to learn a sort of meta language in order to use it. So they work with SQL, which is this language for database querying, but it's not exactly like one to one. So it's like similar, but it has like some differences. Whereas SuperDuperDB is 100% like vanilla Python, and as a result, if you already know Python, then in theory you just need to learn the functions of SuperDuperDB, but that's it. Whereas in MindsDB there are a bit more quirks and so on. And the downside, so in this, or rather like the strengths of MindsDB, is that this enables also non-technical or semi-technical profiles to work with MindsDB, because pretty much any analyst, any data analyst in a marketing department, in a finance department, knows some SQL. So they can get started and then do this AI functionality because they can just write these SQL queries. Whereas in the case of SuperDuperDB, well, you need to know Python. And as a result, this is a little bit more limiting in terms of only Python developers can use it. In MindsDB can be this idea of analyst, but also others in other technical users, let's say like JavaScript developers, web developers, and so on and so forth.
That's super interesting. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so it is so that, let's say for existing Python developers, it is perfect because SuperDuperDB adoption is super simple. Whereas for others who are not in this Python ecosystem, well, easy choice. Do I learn Python for this, or do I use SQL? And it is likely that they already know some SQL, and as a result, they might default into MinesDB rather than SuperDuperDB.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think, if I think about it, I think Statista quoted 2022, you have about 10 plus million Python developers. And it's not the most, I think it's the second most language being used. So, but then, the ability to enable other folks who don't code as well to be able to deploy, solution, that is super interesting. And I guess my question is, people can learn SQL, they should be able to learn Python. Just saying, guys, don't be lazy. That's how I think about it, I guess. But I guess I take your point around, making it more accessible, making it easier for people to build. It's probably part of the reason why SuperDuperDB went down the Python route to begin with, right? My opinion is like, they went down Python because, that is the language that people do a lot of data science on, do a lot of, ML related stuff on. So it feels like they're targeting the ML folks, but make it a lot easier and faster for them to deploy application. I guess my next question then, in my head is, how big is the market, right? Like I could think of it as being very, very big, right? Because like I said, it's gonna be a ultimate power law kind of market. Because if it does become lingua franca, everybody's gonna use it. And then everything that comes before it probably does not matter as long as everyone is still using this going forward. I think the other thing that I have in my mind when I think about market is I think about how do they monetize, right? What's the business model around this? Like they're open source, great. If everybody use it, great. But how do they actually make money from it, right? Based on your conversation with the founders, what have you been able to gather, and also based on your background in this space, what would the business model be like?
Yes, the software remains open source and it's still very early. So I can imagine that now the focus is on getting adoption, growing the community, and so on. So potentially monetization and having a commercial product might not be in their top of their priority list. However, if you go to their website, they already have a waiting list for a cloud product. How I see here and how can I imagine this can be is similar to a company called Vercel, which is very famous and used in the front end web development space. And what Vercel does is they offer a framework called Next.js. And Next.js has become the standard on how front end developers build user interfaces on the web. It is really like the number one. It's very popular, it is free. But Vercel monetizes it by enabling that one can deploy this website that one creates into the Vercel cloud, and they take care of serving this website in like the caching, making it fast, efficient, and so on. So I
Yeah.
can imagine something like this, where in the end you develop any application with SuperDuperDB, and then you say, hey, now it's time to like deploy it somewhere, and this deployment needs to be easy, robust, needs to be simple. So then I do this on SuperDuperDB, and then they charge for the number of requests that they get. If my model is popular and is used by everyone in the company or by a lot of users, then I pay more. If it's not that used, if it's more an internal tool, I pay little. So something like that, probably of pay as you go, usage-based pricing for the deployment of the models.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in terms of usage-based pricing, I guess I'm just thinking about, so is it gonna be like target customer then? Is it gonna be more of, smaller startups, or are they gonna aim at, larger corporates as well? What's your thought around this? Or it could be both. I don't know.
I think that the goal of any company in the tech space is always to target the enterprise. So it is unlikely. Yes, it's always software, like all the big contracts are, the big names, the logos, and so on. So
Yeah.
I can imagine that any founder will never say no to the enterprise. But if we look at the product itself, I do think that the product is a very nice fit for small teams, solo developers, startup teams, and so on. There are so many freelancers out there who are asked, hey, can you develop an application so for my business, for my use case, and so on? And these are,
Hmm.
so let's say like one person shops, and they need to take care of everything. So for them,
Yeah.
SuperDuperDB is the perfect solution. The SuperDuperDB takes care of a lot of the heavy lifting. They can focus on developing this logic and doing the machine learning models,
Yeah.
and they can use SuperDuperDB as a way to connect to the data, as a way to deploy the application, and so on and so forth. So for them, it's
That's super
perfect.
interesting. That's interesting. So if you think about, I'm thinking about like a little SME. So there are a lot of like SMEs in the world. They have deployed some sort of, databases to keep track of the data, right? Somewhere, somehow. And then if you're able to, just run a consultancy and build a super duper DB on top and use super duper DB as a way to deploy AI applications on top of all these old SME applications, right? Because SMEs are not necessarily going to need as performant as a, I don't know, large Visa or Mastercard that ping few million times kind of thing. But that's so interesting, which means it's really enabling a lot of smaller players to come out with applications without the headaches. As you know, I was just thinking about this is really allowing AI developers to do AI, and they take care of everything around them. It's a bit like you go join a football academy where you go in and you play football. Everything else is taken care for you. Your food, your lodging, everything else. But that's really cool. I guess from a corporate standpoint, from how I think about it is, obviously AI application at the moment is getting a lot of scrutiny from regulators, let's say from a banking perspective, which is what I understand the most, is that the ability to explain an AI model, it becomes super important because you need to be able to show, um, why is it coming out the output as it is? There's some sort of model governance around it. Making it a lot easier also needs to make it a lot more explainable. So that could be something interesting should they want to go down to the enterprise route as well. Given that they are open source today, the explainability is only relevant mostly for enterprise. That could be another monetization feature that they offer to enterprise, for example. Making it a lot easier for you to deploy, and then now making it easier for you to explain on the model that is deployed on top of a database. That could be an interesting solution. What are your thoughts around that?
Yes, I see that perhaps at the moment all the necessary features to have this enterprise adoption might not be necessarily be there. So yes, as you said, all these access control, governance, and so on are essential for the enterprise. I might not be there, but yes, I think that as the framework evolves, and also in order to differentiate itself not only from this company MindDB, but also, for example, from LangChain, which LangChain is like the default way to build AI apps, and they are almost this standard. They need to offer these additional features, and you can argue, yes, SuperDuperDB also lets you do classic machine learning use cases, and it's much broader than something such as LangChain. But at the same time, LangChain is a name that by now everyone in AI knows about, that companies understand and are asking employees or potential employees to develop skills around LangChain. So as a result, it might be that also LangChain ends up going in similar direction as SuperDuperDB. And one way for SuperDuperDB to differentiate itself is like to really start targeting these enterprise use cases and say, hey, in order to monetize our product with this SuperDuperDB cloud, we'll offer everything from SOC 2, HIPAA, and so on certifications, and all the way to having all these access control and governance features that so a regulated industry such as finance will require.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think even within large corporates, the AI governance processes are not necessarily there yet, if you will. If it's either they, over govern or under govern, which they don't do much. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to be able to break into this space. I guess if I were to, you touch on something really interesting, which is around how other players within the space, MindsDB, LangChain, might be able to go around the similar use cases as SuperDB. That comes into mind on how defensible is SuperDuperDB. I think in my head I'm thinking about like you said, if they become lingua franca, then it becomes user lock-in. But other than that, would love to hear your thoughts as well. How defensible is Super Duper DB, and what is it that they need to do from this perspective?
Um, yes, this is something that is so one can debate quite a lot on. Um, so how can it have this defensibility? In the more it matures and the more users, yes, there is a lock-in. The other thing that makes it so defensible to a certain extent is the level of integration. So if you go to the website, there are so many integrations with all type of database vendors or technologies and so on, and this takes quite some time to develop. So maybe you can have, let's say, like a proof of concept that is very similar to SuperDuperDB that you coded over a weekend and say, hey, here is my SuperDuperDB alternative. But getting all these integrations in place, that they work, they're maintained, they're robust, is a whole different story. That is quite complicated to get right. There's quite some
Yeah.
time. So this is something that as SuperDuperDB matures, then this gap with any new entrants will increase. But what I'm also thinking is from the side of in differentiating itself, MinesDB. So where we're saying MinesDB has been a bit longer in the market, has raised a significant larger amount of funds compared to SuperDuperDB. So in those cases, Max, what do you advise? So SuperDuper is much more newer, much more smaller, much more nimble. How can it take against these more entrenched players in the market?
Interesting. I think my general sense is, instead of advice is based on, I guess, my observation of what they're doing. So they obviously got some funding from MongoDB Ventures. That in itself is super interesting, right? Because MongoDB is one of the most famous databases out there. If their ability to become bolt on onto MongoDB every time everyone use MongoDB, SuperDuperDB is available, that is super interesting. So like getting a strategic as a distribution channel will be super interesting. That's how I think about it, because it kind of just supercharge your ability to reach clients without having to knock on everyone's doors, if you will. And number two, it also brings some sort of credibility, which allows you to, roll out your solution a lot quicker. And I think separately, I actually think that, it depends on which area they're trying to tackle as they go. The funding, I would say the optimal funding environment will probably allow them to build quicker, number one. Number two, and because of the optimal funding environment, they will have to be very, very disciplined on where they deploy their solution. Where they decided to build features for, and they are probably going to speak to a lot of their community members in order to get that input. So I think building up the community as they have done so far would be super interesting, right? So I guess those are the two things, right? Like, or some sort of like strategic partnership from a distribution perspective, and then some sort of, building with the community is also
Yes.
super interesting. So I think either or, I'm thinking about how to build and how to sell via strategics to reach some of the bigger players, bring in the ticket sizes. As you said, with all the interesting solution and hosting some of it, like the Vercel business model. And the other side also continue to work with the community to build out all these key functionalities that people are looking for, so that the deployment, the usage of it will become more of it. And if they truly want to be the Ruby on Rails of AI application, then the community build is super interesting. So I guess those are some of the things that I can think of in my head. And it's by no means exhaustive. It's just super interesting to think about.
And from a VC perspective, we're in 2024, and so this since 2023 we talk about this is the year of profitability, revenue, and so on. So how do you judge, or how do you see companies in a similar vein, such as SuperDuperDB, that are focused on first this community building approach, where
Yeah.
monetization is not yet fully there or non-existent at all, and where the product itself is provided for free as an open source product? How do you judge them? Do you think is a good moment for them, or they might have maybe some challenges getting interest from investors? How can they thrive in this environment?
So I think ultimately the proof point is, we talk a little bit about this. They are indirectly targeting the same type of users compared to LangChain, compared to MindsDB. And whoever can win the hearts and minds of those developers, which is where I feel like the investors will come to. Hence, my comment earlier about developing the community of developers, making things a lot easier for people to deploy AI solution. That would be, I guess, the key, right? It's almost coming back to what Vicey always says, right? Build something people want. So I think that is one thing to think about. And yes, the funding environment is probably going to be very challenging. Um, I think it comes down to how can we utilize the solution to prove value as fast as possible and as soon as possible. I think that the story that we've been telling so far and its ability to eventually become like a Vercel slash Ruby on Rails, I think that would get investor excited. Personally, I feel like it's a venture bet. And the question is, how good is the team, whether or not they can bring it to that venture-like return, right? So that's something that I have in my mind. And I guess separately, because we're in the year of profitability, it's probably good to think about, what's the monetization strategy. We obviously conjectured that they might go down the Vercel path, but they might be able to come up with something more interesting, that, allow them to provide value to others, but at the same time extract enough value to become a big company. So those are, I guess, some of the things that I can think of at the moment. Even as an investor, we probably care, I guess, a lot about, the traction, the team, and I guess fundamentally, is it a vitamin or is it a painkiller? Are we solving a big problem here? Which in my head, it feels like it.
If you were to have one advice for the SuperDuperDB team or anyone in this space building a similar type of framework, what would that be, Max?
Make it easy for people to deploy AI applications is super interesting. So if I can use it to deploy AI application to replace my own job, I think that is it. That is the holy grail. Right? So if you make it easy for me to deploy AI application myself, and then let's go. I think, like we said, last week, a lot of existing software solution will eventually deploy AI. The market is big enough, and build something that is, I guess, making it easier for people to deploy AI. I think SuperDuperDB is probably on the right path already. They have the right mission.
I see similarly. I do see that. So making it easy might be really this mode where, of course, adding new integrations make a lot of sense, but also new integrations mean complexity. And if we can lower the threshold for people to adopt AI, which is where we're at the moment, most people are just starting to adopt the solutions. And SuperDuperDB positions itself as the easiest way to do these AI applications, then they can really capture this community. And from there, well, they have this mode that is impossible to overcome. And as a result, later, if they decide to do the enterprise product or a cloud solution and so on, well, it is there. But along with this very faithful, very enthusiastic community that is growing of new developers doing AI applications, well, that's everything that is needed. So I do hope that they focus on this usability and easy of use of building AI applications within minutes.
Yeah, lower barriers to entry is what comes to mind. Democratizing the ability to build AI application, using the buzzword of last centuries. So yeah, cool. Um,
Fantastic, Max.
yeah, thank you very much. This is exciting.
And in our next segment, we'll be talking with SuperDuperDB with the two founders, Timo and Duncan. Well, great talking to you, Max. Then let's
Yeah.
reconnect next week. Today, at the AI Engineer podcast, I am pleased to have Duncan and Timo from SuperDuperDB. SuperDuperDB is a database that enables anyone who knows a little bit of Python to get machine learning and AI ready for their apps. I'm pleased to have them today to tell us more about their project, about their life, and about how one can become a better AI engineer. Welcome, Timo and Duncan.
Hi, Rod.
Hi.
Pleasure to meet you.
Timo, I've seen your CV. Duncan, I see also yours. It is very diverse. On one side, Timo, you have this very strong business background. Duncan, you have this very strong technical background. And SuperDuperDB is at the same time a very technical product, but it's also for a user base who is not that technical. So why don't you tell us first a little bit about yourself and how is it that you end up where you are now?
Yeah, Duncan, maybe I can start as I'm as you said correctly, I'm not an engineer, not a data scientist, but I happened to become a tech founder pretty much right after my studies. Made an internship in an advertising tech company, and then decided with two friends to kind of found something. And then I ended up being not just responsible for building up sales and so on, but I was always highly interested in actually product management, and I would kind of design the initial prototype and then kind of build a development team, and would always work very technical. Duncan, I actually met through a friend when they were still studying in Berlin. So we have been friends for, I don't know, nearly 10 years. But when after handing over my edtech company after 7 years, Duncan and the other friend, three of us, we decided to found another company together, and it was my real first involvement in AI. So we created an AI innovation lab actually. So the idea was really to focus on technical development, prototyping, but really leaving out the uninteresting stuff, which is basically selling and marketing products. And we created that company called LF1 in Berlin. And we then were starting with our first project, which was an AI based e-commerce search and navigation suite. So a couple of online AI services for online shops, semantic text search, reverse image search, auto data enrichment services, and so on and so forth, all based on vector embeddings of the e-commerce products. So we started in fashion, right? Most likely the data set of an e-commerce product is a combination of a couple of images, some textual data, some IDs. And we would develop our own models, which would create multimodal vector embeddings of these products, right? And based on these vector embeddings, we could kind of spawn different services. And yeah, that was pretty nice because it was way before the hype, right? When with generative AI and vector search and so on. And it's very transparent because you could just go onto the websites of the big online shops, Zalando, Adidas, ASOS. Of course, very Europe-driven back then because I'm originally from Hamburg. I live in Berlin as much as Duncan. Duncan, you can also introduce yourself afterwards, right? Exactly, but it was super exciting because you could just live on the web compare your services and in the performance, how the search case, we would basically just scrape the big online shops and then have a side-by-side comparison of existing solutions of really these big companies compared to what we would create on our own, right? And we would face not just the model development, experimentation, prototyping, but also then bringing these models into production, serving large online shops with a lot of traffic, right? So inference. The training use case is not so complex because in e-commerce, especially in fashion, there's not so many products. But it was just very exciting. And then when we were kind of done when we have already created this very end-to-end solution, including the deployment, then we would see, okay, what can we do now with it? The idea was really to just focus on prototyping. So we reached out to some e-commerce players, but very quickly we were contacted by a SaaS market leader from Britain. And they were kind of saying, look, your demo is so convincing. We really would like to form an exclusive partnership. And actually, we would like to buy the whole thing. And as we didn't really want to sell the company, but we wanted to just sell the IP, we did an IP sale, and then we helped them to onboard these algorithms, to own them, to be able to develop them further. And we would bring them live very quickly on like these huge brands like Adidas, like ASOS, and like a dozen other big online shops, which was kind of great because we saw just the pain points and the tech stack and infrastructure of this e-commerce team, but also ultimately the end customer, which were all these online shops, so various organizations and how they would approach this challenge, because it was just starting. There's a lot of stuff coming from open source, from research, which people were really struggling to leverage, right? Except of the big tech, Facebook, Meta, Google, Amazon, and so on. And while we were implementing and building these solutions for e-commerce, we would implement our own, or we would start to build our own tooling. So actually, after this first project, after we sold the IP, we would not only help the buyer to kind of build these technology, we would also have another open source project which we participated in the PyTorch annual hackathon, which was Paddle, was like a pipeline builder, and kind of we lost interest in the project because we're just like basically following the narrative and the paradigm in ML ops. And we also had this idea still, I think, Duncan, you can get to that when you initially had the idea of basically bringing AI to the database, like integrating AI at the data source instead of moving the data away from the database. Yeah, and that's kind of, we then decided, look, this romantic AI innovation lab, or it's nice, but in order to create something which is like, which can kind of become a bigger impactful thing, we need to focus on one thing. And that's when Duncan and I decided to really kind of focus on SuperDuperDB and really follow this open source path, because we also believe in data science. It needs to be open source first. It's important for society, and it should be community driven. And yeah, that's how we ended up being here with you. Right. So yeah, this was a long introduction. Maybe Duncan, you want to?
Yes, it has been a very long journey. So I'm curious here, Duncan. So on your side, so from the technical side, I saw that. So you also have a PhD. You are very mathematical. But now you're entrepreneurial.
Yeah, I mean, so what can I say? I mean, Timo mentioned many things. So I studied mathematics as an undergraduate in England, in Oxford, and I come from a family where we didn't ever have a computer. So when I studied mathematics in Oxford, because of the way they teach it there, I never even used a computer, which is bizarre. It was like 2007. So until I was, 23, I had never programmed a computer, but I'd gone very far with mathematics. And so then, it was the first year, I think, where machine learning sort of popped up on my radar was then 2007, 2008. And so I quickly had to adapt and to learn programming and also learn other things. So fairly quickly, I was working in a research lab that was doing classical machine learning. And, it was pre-GPU days, but still there was a large SunGrid cluster. And so it was clear that people who were kind of in inverted commas powerful with their tools were good at bringing their mathematical algorithms to the compute. So that was the way to get results and to get conclusive results and to make progress. But because I had this background where I wasn't familiar with computers, it immediately seemed sort of bizarre to me, this, like, the thing that's really valuable, this compute and data and so forth, is so hard to connect with your algorithms. And so I think that background allowed me to start, to think about how could we do this more easily. And so I was always looking for ways to optimize the journey between connecting the mathematics with the compute, with the data. And fast forward to 2018, before we started the innovation lab with Timo, I was working at a company called Zalando, which had a small research lab, but very small comparatively with big tech. And there it was super hard to get compute provisioned because it was publicly traded, it was a European company, and you couldn't just click on an instance in the cloud and start your environment and just start computing. There was red tape around that process. So we set up a system to automatically start instances and to pull in the code and start computing in a scalable way. and we got to certain discoveries which allowed us to outperform BERT on German language with a model called FLAIR, which then itself became a big open source project. It's FLAIR NLP. It's run by Alan Ackbeck at Humboldt University. And the genesis was like, we're in this kind of suboptimal situation. We have to make the most of our resources. And so you have to kind of use your ingenuity a bit. And not everyone is in this privileged position where they can just spin up hundreds of GPUs and just work without a problem. And so that's the premise. And then it became even more urgent at Aleph One in e-commerce, managing many customers that had different data requirements. And then it was clear to me that sometimes the data is actually the most painful point in the development cycle, especially if you have different sources of data which need to be transformed before they get ingested as tensors into your model or as arrays into your machine learning models. And so it was clear to us that we wanted to have an environment that was flexible enough to allow us to do a range of different things from AI and machine learning, and would also allow us to connect flexibly with our data. So it had to be super flexible and conform to the requirements, but at the same time, we wanted it not to be really hard to get started. So you've got these two conflicting pressures to be flexible, but also to make it easy for beginners. And that's what we've created at SuperDuperDB. It's an environment where getting started is very, very easy. You can take our notebooks, you can use your OpenAI key to quickly create some embeddings. You can use as embeddings to do Q&A, for instance, and you can follow our examples. But if you want to, you can deploy this thing on Kubernetes with custom hardware and bring your own models. And so you have the full range from complete beginner, no code, low code to advanced research potentially being supported by environment. And we think that's the right way. And it's possible because we're trying to go with the zeitgeist, which is AI, machine learning through open source in Python. And that's created these possibilities for us.
And before we delve fully into SuperDuperDB, let's take a step back. And you have been in this space pretty much by already 15 years. And I was wondering, what is your take on what has changed, what has remained the same in the machine learning, data science space? You were mentioning that at Zalando was very hard to get these instances, to get the right hardware and the right environment. Has this improved? Is it the same? How do you see the current situation for the machine learning practitioner at the moment?
All right. So, I mean, one thing that's stayed the same is that a machine learning model is basically a nonlinear mathematical transformation that takes some numbers and outputs some other numbers. So that's remained the same since time immemorial, since the 60s when the first machine learning models, I guess, existed, and also hundreds of years, we've had linear models and so forth around. So that's going to stay the same. It's been the same, will be the same for a while. The thing on the infrastructure side that's become easier is to provision your environment with predictable operating system and so forth. That's definitely gotten easier. So for instance, cloud computing has been for a while easy just to click and get an instance which you connect to by SSH, and then you manage it yourself. Right? But that's actually still way, way, way away from what you actually want as an AI practitioner, which is what you want is a compute environment where you can just work exactly as you would locally, remotely. And we're still not there. So there are, for instance, things like Colab, which allow you to quickly provision an instance, but then you don't have your data there, or so there's lots of things still missing in these quick one-click solutions. You have other things like SageMaker, which make it much easier to do certain tasks in machine learning, like a classical classification task, train it, deploy it. But then you're missing like the full range of flexibility. So I think we're still quite some way from where we want to be. And then you've got new things such as vector databases. And this is super popular now because they're very useful to use in combination with large language models. So if you have something that allows you to find similar documents to a question that you want to ask, then you're going to be able to provide these documents which you find with your question as context to your chatbot or your large language model, so that the large language model doesn't confabulate, so it doesn't make up nonsense. So even OpenAI, if you ask it a question, it can sometimes invent things that aren't true. And that's just the way that these large language models work. But if you provide some context with documents which are to be true, then you're less likely to get these made up answers. So that's called question your documents, or RAG, retrieval augmented generation. So now there are tools around called vector databases, which allow you to set that up more easily. And they have some limited compute compatibility, so that when you insert documentations, these can get converted into the right format to perform that task. But the problem with those things are they're limited to these few use cases, just for basically searching with vectors and questioning documents. So that's missing the part where you've got complete configurability. Yeah.
And it's great that you mentioned vector databases, because one thing that so around it is that there are more than 20 solutions on the market. So practitioners are often overwhelmed with everything that's happening in terms of libraries, providers, vendors, and so on. So do you have any sort of mental framework or pointers for any practitioner who is trying to decide to do something related to AI, where to start, how to decide between what is here to stay, between what is hype and will disappear fast? How do you structure it?
Right. So I think you need to think about what you want to do. So as in all cases, like, what's your application? So I reckon for 99% of applications, a specialized vector database which can scale in millisecond turnaround times to hundreds of millions of documents or billions is probably not relevant. Most developers who are deploying their own application, or small teams, they're going to have maybe a handful of thousands documents, or maybe 100,000 documents. So for that, you definitely don't need a specialized vector database. And most likely, if you're a full stack developer, you'll be working with something like Postgres or MongoDB. And what I would recommend to these developers is stick with that, because both of these solutions now have inbuilt vector search, which you can just access through those systems. So the pain point, so there's still considerable developer pain, is to prepare your application and your data in the database so that it's ready to be used by these underlying vector search functionalities. So MongoDB now on their enterprise service has Atlas Vector Search, and Postgres has a plugin called PG Vector. So you want to connect your data with those plugins, and this can be a pain, right? So you need to then get a model from open source or an API, find a script which somehow prepares your data and inserts the data in the right format to use those plugins or these services. And so that's exactly what SuperDuperDB can help you with, is just by wrapping your database with SuperDuperDB, you are going to be instantly have access in a fully operational way to these underlying vector search functionalities.
And it's kind of the question, right? Just to add to what Duncan said, right? You have your data stored in your chosen preferred environment, which is battle tested. You have it set up. And why would you want to introduce another specialized vector database for just this one use case? Of course, if you have like a very edge use case with like huge amounts of data, then it might make sense. But it's not for nothing that MongoDB, for example, Atlas is the second widest or most distributed vector database, right? And it's just, when you look at ML ops and the whole market around vector database, I mean, it's a relatively new technology. And it's kind of natural, the evolution, that you have like this process of fragmentation, and basically for every functionality somebody tries to reinvent the wheel just to find some spot and get the attention of the developer and the community, just to kind of ultimately follow some probably commercial motivations. And we're trying to really consolidate and remove this complexity by kind of replacing it with a monolithic has a bad connotation because it doesn't sound flexible. But why do you want one environment with a great experience, which feels familiar, and you want to use your tools you're already working with and you're familiar with within the Python ecosystem, and you don't want to manage with having your data in different places, needing to map them, map the raw data with the IDs of the vector stored in a different location and so on. So this is exactly that. So you should definitely consider not just because, SuperDuperDB is just, as Duncan mentioned, a very convenient way to install a model, an embedding model onto your Postgres, onto MongoDB, onto all the other databases we support, and to generate these embeddings, and then to use them with the inbuilt vector search functionality of MongoDB Atlas, for example, of Postgres, or we also bring our own vector comparison, vector search functionality. So even for MongoDB community or for other databases, you can use vector search with SuperDuperDB. For example, we support the vector search of LansDB. LansDB are one of the major open source vector databases. They have also open sourced just the vector search by itself, which is called Lans, not LansDB, which we integrate. So it's about being open to the ecosystem and exactly allowing or enabling or providing a very low entry barriers, providing simple API and simple solutions, really just flow code. But at the same time, you can bring and build your own vector search and whatever nearest neighbor comparison, if you like.
How do you explain SuperDuperDB to your parents? What is it for them?
Actually, because Rob, I wanted to, now you've got me back to the point. It's very crucial. I think the introduction was like that. And then the name SuperDuperDB suggests it is a database, right? But it's not another database. It's not a database. It's super dupers your existing database. And you can see when you look into the code, basically it's super duper. And then in brackets, it's actually the database you are connecting. But that my parents would definitely not understand that. I think they have hardly an understanding of what a database is. I don't think
Yeah, but I mean, you can still. So I guess you'd have to start with explaining what a database is. So you could, say there's this place that has all the data in it. Never, come on.
I would expect.
So you okay. Mm-hmm.
I would extract it even more. I would basically say we provide software for these software developers to build AI software more easily. And that my parents would probably understand,
I like that description. So let's start like that. So I am a software developer. Let's say I have been developing with JavaScript or Java or Scala. And then I see, wow, there's all this that is happening in AI. I want to get started. And somehow I see SuperDuperDB online. Then what's the next step? What can I do? What are my limitations? Guide me through, walk me through, please.
Oh, there's one critical problem here, because right now, I mean, it's a pure Python framework right now, and currently the API is Pythonic. So we're planning to actually provide JavaScript or other SDKs in the future, but right now, really, it's for the data science community first. From starting really the whole spectrum from junior to like full-on PhD, absolute expert with like 10 years DevOps or MLOps experience. But basically, so I would tell that the JavaScript person, you need to know, you need to learn basic Python at the moment to get going with SuperDuperDB, right?
Okay, so then I am the data scientist who works with Python, but let's say primarily on notebooks, some Google Colab here and there, and then I think, wow, SuperDuperDB, it looks very nice. What can I do as a first step? What can I get started there?
Yes, this is very easy. We do have implemented a bunch of cool use cases or applications, AI applications, which can be found when you look. Basically, when you go onto the repository, you're going to see the use cases, and you can use these use cases directly in your browser in a Jupyter notebook. And you can just really, they're quite straightforward. And it's the beauty of SuperDuperDB. You can implement or re-implement quite robust, quite complex AI applications very easily and very quickly, right? Just following the notebooks, try them out. It's demo.superduperdb.com. And at the same time, or in addition to that, we have a dedicated repository for apps built by the community. So there are already a couple of cool apps inside. I think that's the best way to get started, right? To really just directly jump into these notebooks, maybe, of course, maybe go look at the notebooks and get yourself an overview, and then go to the getting started section into the documentation. But then after exercising a couple of these notebooks, you can pretty much just directly build your own applications. The learning curve is really that simple because it's using basic Python commands.
It's great that you mentioned the topic of use case and applications. And here I wonder, what is like a great use case or a very original one for SuperDuperDB? What has the community created? What has been out there?
I will just continue that, right? So all in all, everybody is of course super hot on generative AI. So large language model chat, RAG chat, RAG, what Duncan was explaining in the beginning, retrieval augmented generation. So not just asking a pre-trained model like GPT or ChatGPT, but providing context information which is up to date, which was not part of the model training. So, like for example, your own technical documentation or some very user manual which gets updated all the time. Whatever, there's million types of things, contracts, everything the large language model doesn't know. And we believe that's great. Of course, also image generation and an audio generation. These generative AI use cases are super interesting. But at the same time, it's also all about the standard use cases, right? They really provide a lot of value, whether it's like classification, segmentation, auto data enrichment, anomaly detection, and so on and so forth. And then also what's super interesting, which the community is not really aware of, are these custom use cases. So when you go into different industries and, for example, manufacturer, they have like optic sensor machine data when they have like whatever their production. So I think, of course, what the community is interested in is these more fashionable use cases, but actually I think it's super exciting if the community, especially like the closed source community, would be more open in sharing these applications, right? Because I think it's very intransparent as long as you really work in these, because it's all closed source. But yeah, we have, for example, a use case where vector search is kind of also in the key, right? Because the vector search allows you to search in just such a more capable fashion as standard keyword-based search. And we have a bunch of multimodal use cases where, for example, talk to your meetings or talk to your podcast. We actually have an application built by Duarte Carmo, who created a search solution for the Changelog podcast series. So you can basically now use natural language to search through all the episodes. Actually, Rod, is something we should definitely look into after this, right? So we can have that. So then you can also, of course, once you have implemented the vector search for audio, where you can say, okay, when did Rod mention, when did Rod talk about SuperDuperDB use cases, and then it will actually give you the exact time codes in episode. I don't know what this one is going to be. So that's already an amazing use case. But then you can, of course, extend it just by building RAG, and then you can have the large language model not just respond to you and provide you with the time codes, but also actually give you the answer, what was discussed, and summarize, right, and just inform you. So that's a huge use case. So vector search, I think vector search is providing a lot of value. For example, we have another use case where you have video search. So it's a workflow. And actually, at this stage, it's to emphasize many use cases are single model use cases. You take input data and then you run classification or segmentation tasks. But the SuperDuperDB makes it very easy to build more complex applications where you have workflows where different models work together. So for example, in this audio use case, it's like you take your audio files, convert them to text, you embed the text, and then you connect the large language model to actually interrogate your text. And for example, in the video search use cases, you take your videos, you cut them into frames, which is not an AI model, it's rather a Python function, and then you vector embed the images, and then you use a vector search to then search through them. For example, one of the notebooks you can try out in the demo environment is video search, and it's like the 1 minute 30 video of animals, and then you can just use natural language, show me happy ducks swimming on a pond, and then it will jump to whatever second 31, where then you have a scene with ducks, and it's like then play monkey. So it's yeah, I don't know, like kind of I lost the connection to your original question, so just keep
No, it
going.
shows that with SuperDuperDB, it offers a wide range of possibilities. It really seems like
Exactly. Yeah.
so many things can be done. And here I was wondering, so, and you were mentioning, for example, here a vector search or also a RAG application and so on. And then when I think about building this type of application, I think I need multiple libraries and components. So here, what I wonder is, can I do this everything exclusively with SuperDuperDB, or let's say where does SuperDuperDB ends, and then I need now to connect it with other framework, let's say like LangChain or Llama Index and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so I can answer that. SuperDuperDB is like a system of wrappers that will wrap your functionality. So you can in principle, take an agent function from LangChain and use it together with SuperDuperDB of, question your documents. You don't need LangChain to do that. And you don't need LangChain even without SuperDuperDB to do that. You can just perform the search with a vector search library, and then the results of that you would insert as a context to for instance, OpenAI API. So LangChain kind of makes that easier. In SuperDuperDB, we have a slightly different approach, but it also makes it very, very easy to get things like question your documents installed and ready. And we have a few other upsides which LangChain doesn't have. For instance, we can keep the deployment up to date. So if someone from another location inserts documents into your collection, your database, with SuperDuperDB, you can deploy it in a way where it reacts to those changes and means that you actually have a productionizable deployment of vector search plus question your documents. But we are discussing how we're going to approach the topic of agents. So how are we going to allow users to have these kind of interactive components, functionality, which they use together with their database? And whether we use LangChain or Llama Index or something that we make ourselves, it's not clear yet.
It would be awesome to sorry. It would be awesome to hear from the people, right? What they think, what they how they. So this is really supposed to be community project, right? And a community effort. So it would be great if people hear that, and then they kind of could also provide us with insights for how they see the whole thing and the development.
And this is what I also want to bring up in that. What is the roadmap for SuperDuperDB? So what are like things that you say, hey, now we do this really good, then which things so we still need to improve, and which things are like in the future that we'll be doing, let's say in the next 6, 8, 10 months?
So currently shall I get that, or do you want to get that?
Yes, of course, makes sense.
Yeah. So we have kind of our open source roadmap is we're going to provide enhanced support for SQL databases. So we already have good initial support, and we have great support for MongoDB, and we want to extend that support. And the other thing that we're working on is self-hosting rather large language models, such as Llama 2, in a way that makes the process much easier. So yes, so that's what we're working on primarily right now.
So if I'm just a new to the whole AI environment, I am just, let's say, a backend Python developer who until now has done Django applications, and then I wanted to get started with AI applications. Which advice would you give me in terms of what should I be maybe learning, studying, practicing? Which software should I be like exploring? Should I learn to use PyTorch? Can I just use entirely SuperDuperDB? So where is my starting point and what is my roadmap?
Yeah, so what advice would I give? I mean, the first thing to know before you do any of these things is to understand what do these new AI functionalities allow me to do. And then to connect that with the use case on your app or your application domain. So this is even before you start programming. And then given your operational requirements, like, am I allowed to share my data with an external provider, or do I need to keep everything behind the firewall, basically? Then you'll have a kind of decision tree which will allow you to act. So if it's okay just to share everything with an external provider and you're not worried about turnaround times or SLAs, then I would use Python to experiment with the OpenAI API. Right, and that would be how to get started understanding the concept of machine learning.
Yeah, I think also even if you have these privacy requirements, I think it's definitely a good starting point to actually check out the APIs, right? Because you have to don't deal with any things within the model complexity or in hosting and so on. So you can just basically check the endpoints and what data can I provide and what do I receive and how is this relevant for my problem statement or for my use case. And then then it's what Duncan says. I think you wouldn't get around actually looking into the basics of PyTorch, right? And also, understand what Hugging Face transformers are.
But, maybe I can say something to that. Yeah. So nowadays, I think like going to the level of understanding how to write your own model in PyTorch is not necessary anymore. So there's so many possibilities which are very low code, which you can use from the transformers library, for instance. There are other very easy libraries to use, for instance, Spacey, if you're interested in NLP. And there are other libraries built on top of PyTorch, for instance, Torch Vision, which allow you to get something very good in very little time. And all of these can be used inside SuperDuperDB. So if you then want to experiment with integrating AI with your data, then you could try our library and see if that works for you. But yeah, generally moving from what you want to do and then connecting that with the right model from the ecosystem.
And again, the fashion of SuperDuperDB is kind of, whatever then you decide you want to do an experiment with, you integrate it with one Python command. You simply query define what is your input data, and then the inference will be taken care of, and the outputs will be stored back into your database where you can then use them for downstream application. So it's really that simple, and also exactly, especially when you're just starting out, you want to try out different things. It's once you've installed SuperDuperDB, it's also not a big problem, right? Can be done fairly quickly. With pip install, you can then really just move super fast, try out different things. And the good part is you have your outputs, and that's the problem, right? You have like your feature store and the outputs, they're floating around in some buckets. They're all structured and available going forward in your database. And then you can compare, for example, different embedding models. How do they work for your use case? Maybe you have one use case where there's one embedding model performing better than the other. And it makes it very easy to experiment quickly, and then just don't get lost in all these details, and just have this central spot which is the data source where we can do everything.
And the year is coming to an end. We're about to start 2024. So do you have any predictions of where are we headed as a industry in AI? Also, what do you think things might change and so on? And given that SuperDuperDB is a little bit in the center of everything that's happening, connecting all these libraries and all these applications, where do you think we're going?
For me, I think it's really also going back to what has changed. I think, of course, now AI has reached mainstream society, right? With the breakthrough in ChatGPT and this image generation, everybody understands. I think all the companies and also, I mean, for the companies, they understand they really have to adopt AI, otherwise there's big chance they're going to be left behind. But I think also for developers and technical people, I mean, it's just an fascinating new technology, right? So everybody will want to kind of be, or many people, everybody wants to be involved. So I think it's just that we have even more increasing interest in basically people who want to get started with these technologies. I don't see there's going to be another technological advancement coming up next year. And also I share like the assessment that, this kind of Terminator, Skynet situation is definitely not going to happen soon, right? Because in the end, like these models are still kind of very uncreative. So I think it's more about adoption, right, of what we currently see. Of course, these models get better, and they're going to, even the image generation. I mean, what's going on there now? We're going to have video generation, which is probably the next big thing. But it's not like this substantial next step, which I see for the upcoming years, which we had now with ChatGPT and the large language models for sure.
I would tend to agree with that, but I would say the models will get smarter and smaller, and there will be more on offer open source, which is going to be shared with the community. And you have this new partnership agreement between a consortium of different companies, including Facebook and IBM. I don't know if you've heard about that. With the aim to really make the open part, open AI, not really open anymore, to kind of deliver on that promise. And that will give us all sorts of new opportunities to embed these models in our applications. They're going to come to the edge. And then you're going to start gradually seeing walking, talking, squawking robots at some point. And so the question for developers is like, how can they get involved in that with the least overhead possible, but have this flexibility, and we're hoping to play a role in that journey. So it's the motion of AI from like an academic thing to a central part of software development and society. That's a very exciting movement.
Although there is already so much, and it's also what's different from 4 years back or 5 years back. I mean, what's available already in all these different fields with computer vision, NLP, it's crazy, right? So there's so much open source technology which is actually to be used instantly in so many use cases, which is can potentially create so much value already. So it's about really finding the use case and these models, and then just connecting them, integrating them with your proprietary data and your applications. And yeah, but of course there's going to become another wave of more advanced open source solutions, and of course also closed source services like other API providers, Mistral and all the other.
One last thing, where do you see SuperDuperDB 1 year from now?
It's the question, but really because it's kind of it is a kind of quite a big vision, and we really hope that potentially we become maybe not the leading standard, but like a leading standard of how AI is integrated with data, and how developers and developer teams integrate AI into the existing stacks. So we just hope for adoption, right? A lot of interest from the community, contributions, and just really that we can kind of, this is the starting point for thriving and sustainable community. Because of course in open source you have these more narrow use cases or projects which have like a very small functionality, and they get so super viral, but then they, a couple of years later they're kind of dying out, and we hope that this can be different, right? Because we want to provide like a more fundamental, substantial, functionality.
And where can people find you? And do you have any message for the audience?
Yes, I mean, best starting point is of course GitHub. It's SuperDuperDB, and from there you should really just check the README first. Of course, we've written a blog post which gives you a good overview of what SuperDuperDB is and why we created it. What problem we're trying to solve. And then from there, you will see different points. What I mentioned before, just checking out the use cases in the docs, of course, checking the docs, and trying out the first use cases. And of course, we have our own community, which is on Slack or Discord, and we would be super happy to welcome you there, and then kind of start discussing, what you think about it, what you think can be improved, what's missing, what's not working. Of course, there's probably like a lot of things which we haven't been able to test yet. But yeah, just check it out and kind of provide feedback. Let us know what you think.
Well, it has been great having you, Timo, Duncan. So everyone can check SuperDuperDB on GitHub and contribute, join the community. And thanks so much for being here today. this is all for today. I really enjoyed the chat that I had with Duncan and Timo from SuperDuperDB, and of course, the fantastic discussion as usual with Max. What are your thoughts? Are you using SuperDuperDB? Will you start using it? If not, then why is that the case? Have you heard of MindsDB? Do you like it? Share all this in the comments. Like it, subscribe it, reshare it. Give us your feedback. Only through feedback can we get better, as we know from machine learning. And remember to join our AI community for hackers, the AI engineer. We are the AI dog typers.